Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, Emily Carter stood at the corner of Hawthorne Boulevard and 34th Avenue. Where the cracked sidewalk met the faded yellow paint of the bus stop sign, the air was often heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the edges of her scarf and soaked into the hem of her coat. She always arrived on time, never early, never late. The number 33 bus rolled up at 7:05, its headlights slicing through the early Portland haze like twin beams of quiet understanding. It was an old bus with a faint smell of vinyl and exhaust, but it was reliable, like Emily herself. She had been riding the same route for nearly 3 years, ever since she started working as an administrative assistant at Langley & Brooks, a mid-sized real estate firm downtown. Her position was modest, her responsibilities routine, and her life, by all external accounts, unremarkable. But Emily found comfort in routine. It gave her days structure and her evenings calm. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment decorated with thrifted bookshelves and handmade quilts. She had no car by choice and by necessity. Her parents, once factory workers in Eugene, had taught her the value of budgeting and environmental consciousness. Owning a car felt like an unnecessary luxury in a city where buses arrived every 15 minutes and parking came with a price. Still, she often felt the judgment of others clinging to her like a second coat. At work, sleek cars filled the company's underground garage. Co-workers boasted about mileage, upgrades, weekend road trips. She had once mentioned her reliance on public transportation during a staff lunch, only to be met with raised eyebrows and a polite silence that said everything words didn't. Lindsay Moore, the marketing coordinator, had laughed outright. "You're joking, right?" she had said, twirling the keys to her new hybrid sedan around one finger. Emily never responded. She had mastered the art of quiet deflection, of smiling with closed lips and nodding until the moment passed. But the unspoken divide lingered between those who arrived in leather seats with heated steering wheels and those who stood in the rain with a thermos and a tote bag. On a chilly Wednesday morning in mid-October, everything shifted. She stood at her usual corner, arms wrapped tightly around her middle, her gray coat buttoned to the collar. It had rained the night before, and the sidewalk glistened under the streetlight. As the bus approached in the distance, a familiar engine roar rose behind her. Emily turned instinctively. Lindsay's white Lexus sped up to the intersection, its windows down despite the cold. In the passenger seat was another employee, Tricia from accounts, laughing loudly at something on her phone. As they passed, Lindsay leaned on the horn, a long, pointed honk that startled a flock of pigeons nearby. Emily didn't look up. She kept her gaze on the street, her body rigid, but she heard the laughter, saw the flash of a phone held in her direction, and felt the sting before it even registered. She boarded the bus quietly, took her usual seat near the window, and pretended to read the same page of her paperback novel for the next 45 minutes. The day dragged on as most days did. Her desk was tucked into a corner near the supply closet, where the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to irritate, but not enough to report. She filed reports, scheduled meetings, and fetched coffee for the same managers who rarely learned her name. At lunch, she sat alone in the staff lounge, scrolling through her phone while nibbling on a granola bar. That evening, while walking to the bus stop, she passed the company parking garage. She paused for just a second and caught a reflection in a black-tinted car window. Her coat looked faded, the color dulled by too many winters. Her shoes, scuffed at the toes, betrayed years of pavement. She straightened her posture and walked on. The number 33 pulled up on schedule. Hank, the driver, gave his usual nod, a small, silent gesture that Emily had come to appreciate more than most greetings. She returned it with a polite smile and made her way to her regular seat, third row from back, window side. She placed her bag on her lap, pressed her head against the cool glass, and closed her eyes. That night, she dreamt of water. She stood alone in the middle of the street while a storm poured down, soaking her through. Cars passed, splashing her with more water, but none stopped. She held a piece of cardboard over her head, but it disintegrated in her hands. She woke with her cheeks damp, unsure if it was from a dream or something deeper. The next morning was dry but colder. She left her apartment bundled up, wearing the same coat and scarf, her tote bag heavier than usual with end-of-quarter paperwork. As she waited for the bus, she didn't hear a horn this time, just the sound of distant traffic and the occasional footsteps of other commuters. It felt like the city had retreated a little from her. The silence was not comforting. It was isolating. She boarded the bus, gave Hank his customary nod, and walked to her seat. That day at work, something was off. The receptionist looked at her a little too long. Someone in marketing stifled a laugh when she passed by. At lunch, she overheard her name, followed by the word bus. Her stomach turned, but she didn't confront anyone. She went back to her desk, typed until her fingers ached, and left exactly at 5 o'clock. As the bus rumbled through the city that evening, Emily didn't notice the changing trees or the golden wash of the setting sun. She stared at her reflection in the window and wondered, for the first time in a long while, whether her quiet life was worth the price of invisibility. When the bus stopped at 34th, she stepped down, adjusted her scarf, and walked home with a weight she couldn't name. Tomorrow, she knew, the routine would begin again. But something inside her had shifted, just enough to let the cold in. It was mid-morning on Thursday when Emily first noticed a tension thickening around her cubicle like smoke. There were no pointed fingers, no outbursts of laughter, no open cruelty. At least not yet. But there were glances. Subtle, lingering ones. A whisper that stopped when she walked into the break room. A stifled snort from someone behind her in the elevator. The kind of silent mockery that burrowed under the skin and stayed there. She had just returned from a supply run, arms filled with printer paper and ink cartridges, when she caught her reflection in the office's glass partition. Her eyes looked tired, her posture unsure. She dropped the supplies onto the shelf by the copier, adjusted her cardigan, and tried to push the unease away. But something was different. Something had changed since yesterday, and it wasn't just the temperature outside. At lunch, she sat at her usual table near the vending machines. She had packed her meal like always, hummus carrots, an apple, and a boiled egg, but her appetite had fled. She stared at her phone, scrolling through emails, until a sharp laugh erupted from across the room. Lindsay Moore sat at a high-top table with 3 others from the marketing department, phone in hand, screen turned outward. They were all watching something, laughing. Emily kept her eyes on her apple, pretending not to notice. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Who even uses cardboard? Lindsay said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. I mean, I get climate change, public transit, whatever, but this, it's comedy gold. Another laugh. Then a male voice chimed in. You're going to post that to your feed, right? That deserves a bigger audience. Emily's heart thudded. She knew. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need to see it. But she did. Later that day, tucked away in the restroom stall, she opened her phone and searched. It didn't take long. In a matter of seconds, she found it. Posted in an internal company group chat, shared by Lindsay under the thread, Throwback Thursday to last week's weather tragedy. There she was, captured in grainy, rain-soaked video, standing at the corner bus stop with a piece of cardboard balanced awkwardly over her head. The camera had caught the angle just right. Her soaked coat, her hunched shoulders, the wet sidewalk reflecting the fluorescent light above her, and the caption beneath it. Some people still live like it's 1995. She didn't remember the exact moment the air left her lungs, but it did. She sat in that stall for over 20 minutes, staring at the screen, unable to move. Her name wasn't tagged, but it didn't matter. The thread was filled with comments, laughing emojis, jokes about time machines, quips about cavemen and horse-drawn carriages. One reply simply read, "At least she's recycling." By the time she returned to her desk, her body moved on autopilot. She answered emails, forwarded reports, and updated spreadsheets, but nothing registered. The floor beneath her felt uneven, like the ground was tilting away from her. Every footstep down the hallway sounded like a drumbeat. She avoided eye contact. She didn't speak unless spoken to. And even then, her responses were short, clipped, hollow. The worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the silence between it, the knowing glances, the brief but unmistakable flickers of pity. The receptionist, Jenna, looked up as Emily passed that afternoon and offered a forced smile when it seemed to say, "I didn't laugh, but I saw it." That unspoken acknowledgement only deepened her humiliation. By 5:15, the office emptied out. Emily lingered at her desk longer than usual, pretending to organize files. She didn't want to face the bus. Not tonight. Not after everything. But when the sky darkened and the cleaning crew began to move in, she finally gathered her things. The wind outside was bitter, cutting through her coat like paper. As she approached the bus stop, the usual comfort of the routine was gone. She stood stiffly, arms crossed, waiting under a faulty streetlight that flickered overhead like an interrogation lamp. A passing car honked. She flinched. When the number 33 finally arrived, she boarded in silence. Hank gave his usual nod, but she couldn't meet his eyes. She walked to her seat, placed her tote on her lap, and stared blankly out the window. The city lights blurred past her like smudged memories. She thought about quitting. The thought had crossed her mind earlier that day and now returned with new weight. She imagined drafting a resignation letter, packing up her cubicle, walking out of the office with whatever dignity she had left. It would be easier than enduring the slow public erosion of her identity. But she also thought about the rent she could barely afford, the student loans that still haunted her, the gap that unemployment would leave in her carefully balanced life. She couldn't afford to quit, not financially, not mentally. Not yet. The bus rattled on, each bump in the road jarring her deeper into herself. Around her, the familiar faces of fellow commuters came and went, but she saw none of them. Not tonight. She had been exposed, humiliated, made into a joke without her consent. And for what? For daring to live modestly? For choosing not to fake a lifestyle she couldn't sustain? At the next stop, a young couple boarded, laughing about something on their phone. Emily's chest tightened. Was it the video? Were they watching it now? Would everyone on this bus eventually see it? She clenched her jaw and turned her head toward the window, breathing slowly, counting the seconds between stops. She just needed to get home, to be behind her door, to feel safe. As the bus approached her street, she pulled the cord and stood, avoiding the eyes of the passengers around her. Hank met her glance in the rearview mirror, but said nothing, just that same quiet look of acknowledgement. She nodded once, grateful for the absence of words. On the sidewalk, beneath the pale glow of the street lamp, she walked home with her head down. The laughter still echoed in her mind, as did the flashing image of her own soaked reflection. The weight of being mocked for simply existing as herself was heavier than she'd imagined. In the silence of her apartment, she didn't eat dinner. She sat on the edge of her bed, coat still on, hands folded tightly in her lap. Tomorrow was Friday. She didn't know if she could get through another day. Friday morning arrived draped in a gray, unbroken sky. The kind of sky that pressed down on the city like a heavy blanket, muting its colors and dulling its edges. Emily stepped out of her building with slow, hesitant movements. Her face was drawn, her eyes rimmed with the weight of a sleepless night. Her coat hung loosely around her frame, and her scarf was wrapped higher than usual, nearly touching her cheekbones. She had not bothered with makeup. Not today. She didn't care to face herself in the mirror, much less prepare a version of herself for others. The bus stop was quiet. A teenager in a hoodie stared at his phone, earbuds sealing him off from the world. An older woman held a reusable grocery bag on her knee. No one spoke. Emily kept her head down. The concrete beneath her shoes offered more comfort than any passing smile ever could. When the number 33 turned the corner, its headlights breaking to the low fog, she felt her stomach turn. Not from nerves, but from exhaustion. A fatigue deeper than physical. One rooted in shame, in invisible wounds carved by humiliation. As the doors hissed open, she boarded silently. Hank, seated behind the wheel as always, looked up just briefly. His eyes held no judgment, only recognition. That same calm, reserved glance she had seen every weekday morning for years. A flicker of something passed between them. Quiet understanding, unspoken concern, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Emily didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once and moved to her usual seat. From his perch, Hank watched her reflection in the wide rectangular mirror above the windshield. He had grown used to faces that climbed aboard his bus each day, recognizing their moods through the smallest shifts. The way someone clutched their bag tighter, how they paused before choosing a seat, the rhythm of their footsteps. Emily had always been quiet, always kept to herself, but she had never looked like this before. Hollowed out, fractured, as if something inside her had cracked and the pieces no longer fit. Hank had been driving this route for over 15 years. Before that, he had worn a different uniform, served in places most people only saw on maps. He had watched cities burn and watched them rebuild. He had seen people at their worst and at their best. And in the middle of that spectrum, he had come to understand something simple and profound. Pain did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it slipped in quietly and took root where no one was looking. Over the next few stops, more passengers boarded. Some chatted quietly. Some shuffled to the back in silence. The morning routines continued as if the world were untouched. But Hank kept watching Emily, not intrusively, not with pity, but with the kind of attention reserved for those few moments in life when you sense a person unraveling in real time. He saw how she sat rigid, her hands clutched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the blur of the city outside the window. He noticed that she no longer leaned her head against the glass like she used to, that her shoulders never relaxed, that when someone walked past her seat, she instinctively flinched, not visibly, but just enough for someone paying close attention to see. Hank did not ask questions. He did not offer small talk or force comfort. Instead, he began to think about how many people had passed through his bus over the years, each carrying unseen burdens, about how easy it was to overlook someone until the day their silence became impossible to ignore. When the bus reached the downtown terminal, Emily rose slowly, clutching the strap of her tote bag like a lifeline. As she passed him on the way out, Hank said nothing, only nodding once more. She returned the gesture, her lips parted as if she might say something. But then the moment passed. She stepped off the bus and melted into the gray morning crowd. But Hank did not forget the look in her eyes. That evening, as the final routes wound down and the last wave of passengers disembarked, Hank parked the bus at the depot and sat for a long while in silence. The garage around him buzzed with routine maintenance and idle conversation, but his thoughts remained on that third-row window seat, on the young woman who had become part of his mornings, without ever saying more than hello and thank you. He reached into the glove compartment where he kept loose papers and receipts, found a clean notepad, and began to write. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, each word chosen with care, each line an offering of presence. He did not write as a stranger, nor as someone trying to fix anything. He simply wrote what he believed she needed to hear, and what, perhaps, he had needed to say. When the letter was finished, he folded it neatly and placed it in his jacket pocket. The next morning, Saturday, would be his last shift before his usual 3-day break. He would see her then, he hoped. If not, the note would remain in his coat until the time felt right. Saturday dawned colder, with a sharp breeze that scraped through the streets. Emily was there at her stop, bundled but withdrawn, the same familiar outline against the same sidewalk cracks. She boarded with her head down, said nothing. Hank nodded, silently acknowledging her presence as she moved to her seat. He waited until the third stop, when the bus briefly emptied out, then rose from his seat under the pretense of checking a panel near the front. As he passed her row, he slipped a folded note onto her seat and returned to the driver's chair without a word. He did not watch her read it. He did not need to. But as the ride continued and the city passed them by, Hank allowed himself a rare glance in the rear-view mirror. Emily sat still, the note unfolded in her hands. Her eyes moved across the page slowly, then stopped. She didn't cry, not yet, but something in her posture changed. A small breath, a shift in her shoulders, as if the weight she had been carrying had momentarily lessened. He turned his eyes back to the road. The city was still gray, still cold, but something unseen had moved, between strangers and silence, on a bus bound for downtown. Sunday morning was mercifully quiet. No alarm clock, no office lights humming overhead, no carefully chosen words typed into lifeless emails. Emily stayed in bed longer than usual, wrapped in a thick quilt, her eyes open but unfocused. She wasn't thinking about work. She wasn't thinking about Lindsay or the video or the laughter echoing through the office. She was thinking about the note. It had been folded neatly, place of intention, not tossed or left carelessly. The handwriting was steady, slightly slanted, written in pen, not typed, not anonymous. There was no signature, but she knew, the moment she read the words, she knew who had written them. You don't need to be ashamed of who you are. Your presence lights up this bus every day. The world needs more people with the courage to walk their own path, even when others try to make them feel small. The message had not tried to solve anything. It had not denied the pain or tried to cheer her up with false platitudes. It had simply seen her, acknowledged her, lifted her, without demanding anything in return. She had stared at the letter for most of the ride home, reading and rereading it as if it were the first real language spoken to her in weeks. When she stepped off the bus, she had considered turning back, looking up to where Hank sat, to say something. Anything. But the words refused to form. Instead, she had tucked the note into her coat pocket and walked home in silence. Now, in the stillness of Sunday morning, she finally took out again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. She read the lines slowly, letting them settle inside her like warmth in cold lungs. She traced the edge of the paper with her thumb, then turned it over, as if expecting more. There was nothing else, just those few lines. But they had done more for her than anything anyone at work had ever said. She placed the letter on her nightstand beside the worn copy of the book she'd been trying to finish for weeks, and sat up slowly. The apartment felt different. Not bigger, not brighter, but less suffocating. As she moved to the kitchen to make coffee, her steps were still heavy, but no longer dragging. She wasn't healed, wasn't ready to face the office again, but she had been reminded that kindness still existed in the spaces she least expected. By mid-afternoon, she was sitting at her small kitchen table, laptop open, the letter still within reach. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for several minutes. She didn't know if she should post it. She didn't even know if it was meant for anyone but her. But the way it had moved her felt too important to keep to herself. Not because she wanted validation, but because maybe, just maybe, someone else needed to read it too. She took a photo of the letter, careful to crop out anything that might identify Hank. Then she wrote, "I've had a hard week. I won't explain everything, but I've been made to feel small, lesser, invisible. I've been humiliated for simply living my life the way I can afford to live it, and the way I believe is right. But yesterday, someone reminded me that dignity isn't something people can take from you. They reminded me that being kind is a choice. That respect can exist in silence. I found this letter on my usual bus ride. I want to share it because I think more people need to hear these words. Maybe someone else needs to know they're not alone." She attached the photo and clicked post. Then she closed the laptop and walked away. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few friends would like it. Maybe someone would message her in private. She didn't check it again until later that night, and when she did, the screen flooded with notifications. Comments, shares, messages from people she had never met. The post had struck a chord. There were stories, dozens of them, then hundreds. People wrote about the moments they had felt unseen, about strangers who had shown them compassion when they least expected it, about how small acts of kindness had changed them. A teacher who stayed after class, a nurse who sat an extra minute by a bed, a neighbor who left groceries at the door. It was as though the entire internet had exhaled a breath of solidarity. The letter and the story behind it had gone viral. By Monday morning, the post had been shared by several community pages. It had reached the local newspaper's feed. A regional podcast even messaged her, asking if she'd be willing to do an interview. Emily was overwhelmed, not by the attention, but by the sheer wave of empathy that poured in. What had started as a moment of quiet dignity had become a spark in something larger. She didn't answer the podcast request. She didn't care about being recognized or quoted, but something had shifted. At work, the tone was different. Colleagues who had once looked through her now stopped by her desk to say good morning. A few offered awkward, genuine apologies. Even Tricia from accounting left a sticky note on her computer that simply read, "I'm sorry, that was wrong." Lindsay, on the other hand, avoided her entirely. It wasn't long before the Human Resources Department reached out. The director, a woman named Karen Holloway, called Emily into her office on Tuesday afternoon. The meeting was brief but direct. HR was aware of the incident. The video had been addressed. There had been consequences, though the specifics were not shared. What mattered more, Karen said, was the outcome. "We've been reevaluating our internal culture," she told Emily. "How we treat each other, how we value empathy in this workplace. Your experience brought something important to light." Emily listened, unsure where the conversation was going. "We'd like to invite you," Karen continued, "to be part of a new initiative, an internal committee focused on equity, inclusion, and respect. We want real voices involved, people who understand how it feels to be overlooked." Emily said yes, not because she had suddenly found confidence or clarity, but because it felt like something she could give back, not to the company necessarily, but to herself, to the version of her who had sat on that bus with tears in her eyes and shame pressed into her chest. She didn't tell Hank any of this. She wasn't sure how, but every morning when she boarded the bus, she made sure to look up and meet his eyes. She smiled, softly at first, then with more warmth each day. He always nodded, the same way he always had. But now there was something else in the glance, not just recognition, connection. On Thursday, as she exited the bus, she paused, her hand on the rail. She turned toward him. "Thank you," she said, quiet but clear. He didn't ask for an explanation. He only smiled and said, "You're welcome." Sometimes, the simplest words are the ones that echo longest. Over the weeks that followed Emily's post, Portland seemed to change in small but tangible ways. The mist that settled each morning found itself met with more willingness from bus shelters to offer shelter. Coffee shops along her route posted signs reminding customers, "Dignity matters." Public transit displays included messages about kindness, about sharing space, not just physically but emotionally too. Emily rode the number 33 each day, now with something like anticipation in her chest, a cautious hope she had thought she'd lost long ago. At Langley and Brooks, the inclusion committee she joined began its work. The first meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, where sunlight leaked in at sharp angles. Emily, seated at the table among senior managers, HR representatives, and a few other employees with quieter voices, listened as Karen Holloway outlined their purpose: to create real change in a company culture that had tolerated invisibility and mockery for far too long. Karen asked for suggestions. Emily's throat tightened, not with fear, but with something like resolve. When she spoke, she did so softly, but her words carried a weight that could not be ignored. She suggested mandatory empathy training for all employees, workshops where colleagues could share stories rather than critiques. She encouraged anonymous reporting channels that ensured people wouldn't be penalized for speaking out. She proposed that internal communication policy be revisited. Internal chats where videos or images were shared without consent should be reviewed, and that leadership explicitly condemn ridiculing behavior. The room was silent for a moment as her peers absorbed the implications. Then nods, then murmured agreement, then real, concrete steps were added to the agenda. Meanwhile, the bus company that Hank worked for received messages, emails from commuters who had read Emily's post, local news outlets asking to interview Hank. For him, the attention was unsettling. He had never sought recognition. He simply had seen someone in pain and offered what he believed might help. He continued his morning routes, pressing his palms steady on the wheel, greeting riders with nods, doing his work. But now, he carried something new, a sense of purpose that his duty mattered in ways he had never thought to measure. One morning, as Emily boarded relatively early, she could feel the tension before she even entered the bus. There was a hush. A group of passengers gathered near the entrance, talking in lowered voices, looking at her. She stared ahead, hoping it was nothing. To her surprise, one of them, an older man with a gray beard and a folded newspaper under his arm, approached her as she moved toward her seat. "Miss," he said, voice gentle but steady, "you don't know me. I saw your post. I just wanted to say thank you for telling the truth, for reminding us what kindness looks like." Her chest tightened. Her eyes watered. She nodded. "Thank you," she said, barely more than a whisper. He smiled and stepped back, returning to his seat with a dignity that seemed to belong to more people now. At work, the changes persisted. Lindsay, after being formally reprimanded, was required to undergo sensitivity and respect training. At first, she avoided Emily entirely. No eye contact, no greetings. Then, after one coaching session in which she listened to stories from co-workers, including Emily, she sought her out in the hallway. "Emily," she said one afternoon as Emily opened the office door. I want to apologize. What I did was wrong. I was trying to be part of something, to fit in, I guess, but that's no excuse. I hope you can forgive me someday." Emily closed the door behind her, turned and looked at Lindsay. The emptiness of the past week still lingered in her shoulders, but she met the apology with something she hadn't expected. Compassion. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." The silence between them was not awkward. It was honest. Encouraged by the momentum, Emily began speaking at company gatherings, local community groups, even at a public transit advocacy meeting. She told her story, the humiliation, the note, the post, but she made sure to focus on what came after. She spoke of courage, not as something grand, but small acts done boldly. Choosing to ride a bus when everyone else mocks, speaking truth about what felt invisible, choosing to see others. Her voice wavered sometimes, but her message resonated. One evening, at a transit authority town hall meeting, she stood at the microphone in the back of a crowded auditorium. The walls were lined with posters showing transit routes with quotes about community. Someone in the crowd asked, "What do you want people to take away from this?" Emily paused, thinking of wet cardboard, of laughter, of the look in the rearview mirror. Then she said, "I want people to know that kindness doesn't cost you comfort, that respect doesn't ask you to compromise your reality, and that seeing someone really seeing them can change more than they realize." The applause was not thunderous, but it was sincere, steady, inclusive. Around her, heads nodded, eyes glistened, not pity, but recognition. She glanced toward the back corner of the room, half hoping Hank might be there. He wasn't, but in the faces she saw, she felt him. Somewhere among them, people who had stopped joking, stopped looking away, stopped assuming others' lives were lesser. Back in Portland, on a crisp morning when the air smelled of wet leaves and pine, Emily rode the number 33 and boarded with her usual quiet. Hank saw her and nodded. Beneath that, something more, pride. She smiled. As the bus pulled away, she settled into her seat. Through the window, the streetlights cast soft halos above the wet pavement. She looked at her reflection, not as someone broken, not as someone small, but as someone whose light had found its own place in the world. Every time the bus stopped and someone else glanced her way, with respect, with kindness, she remembered the letter, the voice of kindness that had intervened when she was most invisible. She remembered that sometimes the smallest, quietest gestures have the power to shift everything. And now, not just for her, but for everyone who had felt unseen, the world, she had come to believe, might be made better one gentle word at a time. Its arrival was not loud, not dramatic, but as the bus rolled on through the morning mist toward downtown, Emily sat with calm in her heart. The knowledge that she could face the world not simply as someone being tolerated, but someone who belonged. As daylight spread over the city, the reflection in the window revealed someone upright, someone who had turned shame into strength, someone whose journey had begun in silence and now carried a chorus. And in the rearview mirror, Hank, the driver who once watched in silence, exhaled a quiet satisfaction, because kindness, after all, had changed everything.